That's why I'm trying to. This high-level roundtable builds on a two-panel e-symposium on the military coup and democratic reversals in Africa, hosted by the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg in March 2022. Over the past decades, military coups have been tagged as undisputed democratic relapse in Africa. However, the nature of the epidemic of coups in West Africa and the Sahel in the past 4 years has generated questions about whether these military coups are democratic reversals or instruments for democratic development. The military regimes have accused civilian administrations of systemicism and undemocratic tenure elongations. They have also accused them of aggressive power consolidation, autocracy, misgovernance, and even corruption, and that they have lacked the capacity to restore peace and security to the troubled zones in the region, as well as labeling some of the civilian administrators and political leadership as Western puppets. As ECOWAS was strategizing on how to restore democratic order, the military in Niger struck and deposed the civilian administration of Mohamed Bazoum on 26 July last year. ECOWAS immediately gave the military a 7-day ultimatum to vacate office and even threatened to invade Niger and remove the military junta in case of defiance. Military regimes in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were immediately formed a military ally to defend their countries. And on 28 July, the military leadership of the 3 West African governments announced the termination of their memberships of ECOWAS and accused the bloc of anti-Pan-Africanism and lack of support, as well as castigating the regional bloc for the imposition of what they called illegitimate, inhumane, and irresponsible sanctions on their countries. This is exceedingly unprecedented in the history of the 49-year-old ECOWAS, which feared the waves of coups in the region and its security implications across board. Amidst the ensuing hostility between the regimes and ECOWAS, the anti-French posture of the regimes, and other unfolding drama, including the coup in Gabon and attempted coup in Sierra Leone on 26 November last year, ECOWAS announced the suspension of sanctions on Niger, on Guinea, and on Mali last month. But the regional bloc retained the sanctions on Burkina Faso. And this has further compounded the perspective of stakeholders in the ECOWAS democratic and regionalism project. The seeming legitimization of military coups in the West African region and the future of ECOWAS as an effective regional agency for democratic consolidation, peace, and security. Welcome, colleagues, and welcome the participants, and welcome to our panelists. My name is Dr. Adeoye Akinola, and I'm the head of research and teaching at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. We are very curious today, and we wish to understand the deep-seated motivations for the waves of coups in West Africa and the performances of the military regimes, which usually see themselves as developmental and corrective. And we want to understand this, particularly through the lens of Mali. We also want to understand the complex role of ECOWAS and the place of civil society actors in this ensuing conflict. We also want to interrogate the protocols on intolerance to military coups and unconstitutional government in the region. And we also want to understand the perspectives of the continental body, the African Union. Participants, colleagues, and panelists, I want to turn now to our 5 panelists so that they can actually engage with us and also share their own perspective, their standpoint, and understanding on what many people will call the unfolding drama in West Africa. I would like to introduce the panelists, one after the other. Now, if you will permit me, I will introduce Mr. Ebenezer Asiedu, which is standing in for the Commissioner, Ambassador Musah, which is inevitably absent from today's meeting. But we also trust that Mr. Ebenezer Asiedu is competent actually to speak on behalf of Commissioner Musah and also to speak even on behalf of ECOWAS and share his perspective. Mr. Asiedu is the head of Mediation and Facilitation Division at the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, in Abuja, Nigeria. Previously, he served the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa as a senior analyst, focusing on early warning and preventive diplomacy. Mr. Asiedu holds a Master of Arts in Conflict Security and Development from King's College in London, and also holds a Master of Science in Industrial Relations and Personal Management from the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE. Mr. Asiedu, welcome, and we are eager to listen to you today. Also permit me to also introduce the next panelist. That's Ms. Dr. Abdoul. Dr. Abdul Sogodogo is the Vice Dean of the University of Legal and Political Sciences of Bamako's Faculty of Administrative and Political Sciences. In 2017, he obtained his doctoral degree in international relations at the Central China Normal University in Wuhan, after receiving a master's degree in diplomacy from the National School of Administration of Morocco in Rabat, and also a master's degree in international relations from the Mohammed University of Abuja in Morocco. Dr. Abdul, welcome. We are eager and keen and enthusiastic to also hear from you. Colleagues, permit me also to introduce Dr. Emma Birikorang, who is the acting director of the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana. She obtained an MA in International Politics and Security Studies from the University of Bradford and a PhD in Politics and International Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She's currently researching African peace and security mechanism and ECOWAS AU regional peacekeeping frameworks. She also facilitates training modules on security sector, reform, protection of civilians in armed conflict, risk assessment and conflict vulnerability, and the ECOWAS standby force. Dr. Emma, thank you for accepting to speak to us today. Also permit me to also introduce Dr. Jonathan Sandy. Dr. Jonathan Sandy is the chair of the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Affairs, usually called AU ECOSOC, Peace and Security Sector Cluster. He's also the chairperson of the Executive Board of the Regional Center for Governance and Security Policy Initiatives in West Africa and accredited to the ECOSOC. He continues his career path within the United Nations as an expert for the UNDP on governance, rule of law, security, and prevention of violent extremism. And his primary focus is on the primary focus of his intervention is centered on the management of risks and uncertainties related to the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and silencing the guns in Africa as pathway towards the achievement of the AU Agenda 2063. Colleagues, also permit me to also welcome Dr. Andrews Atta Asamoah. And Dr. Andrews Atta Asamoah is the head of the African Peace and Security Governance Program at the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Dr. Atta Asamoah has a doctoral degree in political studies from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and he spent 3 years as a member of the US panel of experts on South Sudan. He was an ISS senior researcher and at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana. His research cuts across issues of peace, security in Africa generally, but he has a particular focus on issues of African Union diplomacy, conflict prevention, management, and conflict resolution, including conflict analysis, peace support operations, conflict early warning, countering violent extremism, fragile statehood, national resource conflicts, security, sector governance, and transnational organized crime. Thank you so much for also giving me the space to introduce our panelists. And we also have our own Mrs. Ratitso Makombe. Ms. Ratitso Makombe is a researcher at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. She's also a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. And she obtained a master's in international relations from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Her research focuses on human security, including election violence, grassroots conflict, poverty reduction, and sustainable development in Africa. And thank you so much. And without wasting time, I want to call on our own, usually, let's say the ECOWAS boss, because since he's representing the ECOWAS boss, so is our ECOWAS boss, and he will be speaking to us today on this standpoint or the perspective of ECOWAS and the role of ECOWAS, but particularly, we know that ECOWAS has a history of mediation, imposition of sanctions, and armed intervention to promote democracy in the region. What we really also want to understand is the role of ECOWAS in restoring democracy in countries under military regimes. And we are also wondering, why did the regional body leave the suspensions on those three countries and powers? Why did the body leave Burkina Faso on? Over to you, Mr. Ebenezer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And it's good to see you. I know I've known you through other means, but we haven't had any facial contact. So this is the first time I'm seeing you. I'm seeing the face for the first time. Thank you for inviting ECOWAS for this particular engagement. Talking about military coup, sanctions regime, and the role of ECOWAS. Indeed, I must start by saying that ECOWAS Commission, or ECOWAS, let me put it this way, ECOWAS, whatever ECOWAS does is actually rooted and anchored in its normative instruments. We don't do things outside of what the instruments actually say. So whenever we need to, initiate any form of mediation or even impose sanctions on military regimes and other interventions, all those things are actually anchored within our normative instruments. So ECOWAS's role, obviously, in restoring democracy in countries that are actually under military regimes, find expressions in this normative instrument that we have. So specifically for the purposes of this discussion, I'll focus on those 4 countries that are actually under military regimes, i.e. Burkina, Guinea, Mali, and Niger, in that order. That's alphabetical order, but doesn't necessarily mean that they had their coup d'etats in that order. For Burkina Faso, obviously we know that the military coup, the first one happened in January 2022, and then the second one also the same year, I think September 2022. But even before the second one, there had been an arrangement, negotiation more or less with the regime to transit to civilian rule, high democratic order. So in the course of that, then the second coup actually happened. But when it happened, the new regime decided to go by the timelines as agreed with the former one. Oftentimes, in fact, in previous experiences, ECOWAS, whenever ECOWAS had been contended with or had been faced with such a situation, we often gave a timeline not exceeding 1 year. This time, the situation were actually not as before. So the timelines that were given for each of these countries, except Niger, that we don't have timeline, was for 2 years. So for Burkina Faso, the 24th month transition to constitutional order actually took effect from July 2022, before the second coup d'etat. So that's what I said, the second coup d'etat came and the authorities accepted to go with the timeline agreed. So expectedly, we were supposed to actually transit into democratic order by July 2024, meaning this year. Subsequent to that, we had this memorandum of understanding with the authorities regarding the timelines, and we also set up a transition mechanism that's supposed to also help with the timeline in terms of monitoring the timeline. However, I mean, unfortunately, issues or expectations didn't turn out the way we all actually had. The military regime started reneging, giving excuses and all that. Indeed, for Burkina, they have actually, the current regime has indicated that security is their priority, meaning that until they had a security situation under control, transiting to democratic order is not something that is on the table. Of course, we will come to that maybe during the question and answers, some of these reasons. For Guinea, we also had a consolidated 24-month transition timetable that covered 10 priority areas. This was jointly developed and agreed between the transitional authorities of Guinea and ECOWAS sometime in October 2022. The 10-point transition timetable, among others, included the conduct of general population and housing census, administrative census for civil registration purposes, the establishment of electoral register, among others. This was supposed to help them transit smoothly into a constitutional order with the presidential elections that was fixed for September 2024. Nonetheless, along the line, we realized that the commitment to respect the 2-year timeline agreed with ECOWAS wasn't going to be achieved, as authorities announced that they would need equivalent of around $600 million as a budget for a successful transition into any constitutional order. Out of this huge amount of money that they claim they want, the country could only actually provide 40 million that it said it had managed to mobilize, meaning that the 560 million had to be sourced from outside. Indeed, I mean, everybody would realize that for this, it was going to pose as a major impediment to any timely return to constitutional order. As recently as yesterday, the new Prime Minister of Guinea, by name Amadou Uriba, announced or suggested somehow that they will probably return to constitutional order in 2025, meaning that the timeline that we agreed together will not be achieved for that. Mali is supposed to have actually transited, well, latest by this month, if they had actually kept to the timeline and had elections and there were a runoff, then they would have had it this month, because the timeline was supposed to be February 2024, with a possible presidential election and a runoff in March, if there were any runoff. But unfortunately, we don't have it as of now. Of course, we all know the conditions under which we are. We actually saw good signs from Mali actually keeping to the timeline when they had their referendum sometime last year, 2023, to set the ball rolling for the transition. But then along the line, somewhere in September 2023, the transition authorities announced a postponement of the scheduled February 2024 presidential election, citing a number of reasons, all of them technical. One being the fact that with the inclusion of the new constitution, there are some certain provisions in the electoral law that needed to be taken care of. And for that to happen, the transition timeline would not be met. Also, they had also included the Independent Elections Management Authority, which never existed in the previous constitution. And according to that, registration of voters would have to happen that as the only way of ensuring a broader participation by Malians in the elections. So because of that, the timeline that they had given could not be met. And the last but not the least of the reasons that they gave was that of the management of their database that, according to them, had been taken hostage by a company, a French company, and that's a very key and essential aspect of what they needed to unlock the database wasn't available to them. So for that matter, they were not able to meet the timelines. On Niger, we don't have currently have any timelines. Indeed, there were efforts to have timeline with Niger after the 26th July 2023 coup d'etat and the subsequent extraordinary summit that were made. We actually tried very hard to engage the authorities, but every step of the way, they blocked that intervention, meaning that they were not ready. Indeed, I mean, they were angry, obviously, so because of the raft of sanctions that had been imposed on them. And actually, this was the situation because the authority at the time thought that a fourth coup d'etat in successive, in that succession was one too many. And therefore, they came up with all the gamut of sanctions out of anger, you could see, because they met indoors, and before even the summit, they came up with their own decision. So they actually put all the sanctions. Usually what is often done is that the sanctions are done gradually. And depending on whether you are a country is going by the dictates or agreement reached, either it will be de-escalated or escalated in a gradual manner.
We're still online, I told you.
Yeah. So that is exactly what happened with Niger, and they became quite antagonistic towards ECOWAS. So we couldn't make any headway in terms of engagement. The last time we tried to engage, and which they had accepted, that a high-level ministerial mission was supposed to have gone there to, first of all, negotiate for the release of the detained President Bazoum, and also agree on the timeline was 25th January this year. But unfortunate thing happened when the aircraft, the chartered aircraft that the mission was supposed to travel on, developed technical, problems, and therefore couldn't fly. Sorry, the background is a bit noisy because people are, I'm in office and people are having some meetings and all that. So that actually also angered them, and subsequent to that, 2 or 3 days after that, the alliance of countries in the Sahel, AES, are now ECOWAS. Actually, that was the situation that led to or triggered that particular incident. That is just the coup d'etats and also the restoration of constitutional. But then the question of why did the organization lift sanctions? I must say that ECOWAS has not lifted any suspension on any of the countries, 4 countries, which are currently under military rule. We haven't lifted suspension because all these member states are still suspended or remain suspended from the ECOWAS's decision organs. Just like in AU also hasn't lifted suspension. So these political sanctions, so to call them, are still in existence. The suspension, they have not been, the suspensions have not been lifted, so they are still under suspension. They can't take part in any decision-making organs of the AU, of ECOWAS. Same with AU. And also, they can't enjoy the collective support of the region when they want to contest for any position in international at the international level. So that is still in force. What were lifted were majorly economic and financial sanctions that were lifted, and of course, those ones can be seen in the communique of the extraordinary summit that was held on 24th February, particularly paragraph 27 and paragraph 29. And even if you read the communique, you come to realize that these countries were not, those sanctions that we are talking about were not there, particularly Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, after, beyond the suspension of taking part in decision-making organs, were not under sanctions. There were no sanctions on them. Mali had some sanctions, but those sanctions had been lifted way back in 2023, beginning of 2023. The sanctions that actually existed at the time and still exist are particularly sanctions that talks about asset freeze for the officials involved in the coup. And that same also applies to the members of the family members of the military leaders, and also those civilians that also accept to take part in the institution or the government. So these sanctions are seen as political. But generally, if you look at paragraph 27, it talks about those sanctions that have been lifted, and that include the border closures, both land and air borders. All of them have been lifted. These are particular sanctions that were imposed on Niger, but not on Mali and Burkina Faso and Guinea. The only sanction that was on Guinea were some financial and economic sanctions. But in paragraph 29, that particular sanctions have been also lifted. So particularly Guinea, of course, there were no fly zones that have been lifted. They also lifted suspension on all commercial and financial transactions between ECOWAS member states and Niger. All those have, because those things were actually biting, that it was impossible for me, for instance, to transfer money from my account here to anybody in Niger who has a bank account in Niger. I couldn't do that. But now those sanctions have been lifted. So it allowed for free flow of financial transactions and all that. Also freeze on all service transactions, including utility services and electricity to Niger. Don't forget that Nigeria actually locked out its electricity supply to Niger. About 70% of electricity to Niger was supplied by Nigeria. So Nigeria, this was just bilateral. It wasn't a sanction that was imposed on the country by the authority. The other One include freeze of assets of the Republic of Niger. So here it was specific, not assets of the individuals involved in the coup d'etat, but assets of the Republic of Niger in ECOWAS central banks, because that thing was clocked and they couldn't access. And it was also making it impossible for them even to pay salaries of civil service and all that. So all these things actually were lifted. And also the suspension that was also imposed on Niger regarding financial assistance and transactions with all financial institutions, particularly the ECOWAS Bank for Industry Development, yes, Investment Development, ECOWAS Bank for Investment Development, EPID, and also BOAD. Those things were so that they could now access the bank for other this thing. So virtually, those are some of the sanctions that have been lifted. I would leave the discussion here, and subsequently, when the questions come, we would actually delve deeper into that. Thank you very much. Akinola.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Ebenezer. And well, we are having new perspective, and I'm sure our participants are also taking this in, and they must have been preparing their notes to also engage you at the end of the first round of presentations. So thank you so much. I will quickly move now to Dr. Abdul. Dr. Abdul, please, let us understand this. I know that when the military, when they strike, they usually talk about poor governance, and they talk about insecurity, corruption of the political elite, the ruling civilian elite. And I want to ask you, what are your perspectives on the military takeovers? I'm talking about takeovers across many countries in West Africa, particularly in Mali. And I'm asking you directly, are the situations better now in Mali, or even under, or across some of those countries where military have taken over? What is the reality? And do you see the takeovers as obstructions to democracy, or do you see them as enablers of democracy? Dr. Abdul, over to you.
Thank you for this opportunity to meet colleagues and many people to talk about those questions. I hope you hear me.
Yes, and I can hear you.
And sorry for my English. Okay, thank you for those questions. I'm trying all the presentation to answer to those questions. Great. Last 3 years, I mean, 2020, last 3 years, maybe, Mali, Burkina, and Guinea, Niger, they are experiencing 6 coups d'etat, which make a real break in 2 aspects. The first one is the arrival of military powers at the head of those states. The second is an important change in their foreign policy. My question is, how can we explain the resurgence of military coup in West Africa, especially against democracy regime? How do they really destroy or consolidate the democratization process in Mali? Our paper is an attempt to answer those complex questions. Thus, we attempt to apprehend the coup d'etat in Mali through the prism of military putsch theories. We also try to analyze ECOWAS action like Sanctions Regime in terms of democratization in West Africa. In the first point, we will try to explain, give some explanation of those coup d'etat. In the second part, we will try to analyze the regime of sanction and perspective of the ECOWAS. And finally, we will talk about the Malian case specifically, if the coup d'etat is a kind of opportunity or not for improving democracy. As you say, the coup d'etat most of the time came in the difficult periods, like crisis theory tried to explain. And in the Malian case, like Burkina and Niger, the coup d'etat occur when the government in power was unable to resolve a political, economic, and security crisis. That's why we rethink this theory explain better the Malian case. A second theory, opportunity theories, try to explain sometimes coup d'etat occur because some military see an opportunity to take the power because some of the time the government is weakness. And a third theory try to explain sometimes military come into power on the head of state because they want to make some change to modernize maybe the governance because sometimes you have some governments that are so corrupted. Maybe the case of John Rawlings in Ghana is an example. Sometimes it's a kind of balanced theory. Some ethnic group want to come in power because they estimate they are marginated. That may be the case in Chad of this Deby. Talking about Malian case, when the coup d'etat arrived 3 years ago, it was for many Malians couldn't understand the action of the CEDEAO. The question was how a sanction against a state is already weakness because of multi-dimensional crisis can help this country to sustain his democracy. That was a big question. That's why many Malians was opposed to those sanctions because they think at that time those sanctions are not really helping the states to rebuild, but it was a sanction that was imposed by CEDEAO just to make a situation more complicated for those military and give up. But everyone knows those military in power were not thinking to abandon the power. That's why many scholars was thinking at that time the sanctions have excluded Mali from a decision-making body, and also it was separate Malian population from other West African population. That was interpreted as some kind of delegitimation of the CEDEAO himself. The other thing is the sanctions come globally, not gradually. Those sanctions was thinking as a weakness, not there wasn't helping. They were helping. There wasn't helping the West African integration, but it was disintegrated West Africa some way. Many questions come from for ECOWAS. I myself, I observe that ECOWAS depend more on UN and European unions, because when it was the case to help Mali to face terrorism, ECOWAS couldn't mobilize his collective security system to help Mali, because himself didn't have the necessary money and the capability and coordination to fight against terrorism. That's why it was necessary for Mali to call all the world, especially the United States, the United Nations. The second, the other problem is the stagnation of the ECOWAS Common Currency Project, calling ECO. Maybe due to French influence, which maintain the CFA. According to those situations, as it stands, ECOWAS cannot move West African countries toward real integration and development because of its dependence of external funding. It looks like ECOWAS is an unfinished project, because ECOWAS wants to play a role in democratization in West Africa, but it don't have an influence on the electoral process of member states due to the principle of sovereignty. The other thing is the weak influence in the fight against corruption and clientelism in the member states. Finally, the weak capacity to control the internal governance of member states. Those incapability make that ECOWAS have some ambition, but it don't have the capabilities, the fund, the power really to realize those ambitions. For many scholars, the Malian crisis is a kind of opportunity to rebuild the state, and by the way, to rebuild the democracy. It's demand. In this way, the state takes some action, like calling the National Conference of Refundation in 2021 about this INA help the transition to build some kind of guidelines, some action they have to realize, like the refundation of the school, maybe the education system. Also to build a new constitution. That's already okay. This constitution look like a new deal. And also to initiate a dialogue between Malians for peace and national reconciliation. Then we cannot say the coup d'etat is a kind of way to promote democracy, but in the Malian case, we can say it's a new opportunity for Malians to correct, to rebuild, to rectify our democracy, because as it stands, the former government making many things who couldn't help to promote really democracy, like the fraud electoral crisis, the corruption, the insecurity. The former government at his last time doesn't have any solution to resolve national problems, and it lost the legitimacy. I'm not saying the the coup d'etat is the same way, no, but I'm saying the coup d'etat is not a best way to refund a democracy, but if it can, you have to take this opportunity and correct everything you can correct. That's why we think, I'm going to conclude on that, just 1 minute. We have to take this as an opportunity of rebuilding the state in Mali on the basis of social and democratic value. Rethink governance, and as the CDAO is standing now, to get more legitimacy, the CDAO have to change, to develop, maybe to rethink his strategy about how to secure West Africa and how to help states to develop themselves. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdul. We appreciate you for of the conversation, and the very frank conversation at that. I'm sure participants will also want to engage you for questions, and I hope you will permit me to move into the second panelist, talking about Dr. Emma. And Dr. Emma is the acting director of research at the Kofi Annan Institute, Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana. Dr. Emma, the floor is yours, but permit me to ask you very briefly these questions. I know that sometimes when we are reflecting on the waves of military coups in West Africa, and if we also have to reflect on the complex intervention of ECOWAS, as we usually call it, what is the future of its role in combating coups, not only military coup or any other form of unconstitutional governments? And what is its position in also restoring democracy in the region? We will prefer you if you reflect on some of these points in your presentation. Thank you, Dr. Emma. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Oye, for that. And thank you also to my previous panelists, Ebenezer and Abdul, for those presentations. I'm going to reflect and build on what they have already said. And my presentation is actually quite short because Ebenezer has spoken at length about ECOWAS as well as what it's doing in the region. And then Abdul, on the other hand, has given us the empirical case of how the situation was handled in Mali and how things would be going forward. So I have essentially four main points, maybe three or so, to talk about in terms of answering the questions that you just posed. The first is, when we are reflecting on ECOWAS of the people, Ebenezer, and who is ECOWAS? What is this entity called ECOWAS? Who is it? Because I think it's really very easy for us to just bandy the name around. ECOWAS should do this. ECOWAS should do that. Where is ECOWAS? Why is ECOWAS doing this? But who is ECOWAS? ECOWAS says it is an ECOWAS of the people. Previously, it used to be, it was called an ECOWAS of the states, member states, but Now, they said we should call it an ECOWAS of the people, meaning that ECOWAS should be relevant to us, to all of us in the region. However, on the ground, and I think that is where there's a lot of conflict between ECOWAS, not conflict, but there's a lot of hatred to a certain extent. And we saw it in Niger, we saw it in Mali, when the sanctions and the suspension was instituted, and citizens went into the streets and they were criticizing ECOWAS and asking, who is ECOWAS? We do not know ECOWAS, so why should ECOWAS be relevant to us? The citizens do not seem to know what ECOWAS is doing. You only see ECOWAS when something happens in your particular country. But yet, listening to Ebenezer, listening to colleagues at ECOWAS, you realize that they know so much and they are doing so much. And indeed, Ebenezer spoke about a lot of the host of follow-on actions that they have taken in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, in Mali. I mean, these are all fantastic things that they are doing, but nobody hears about them until you call an ECOWAS official into a meeting and then you are hearing all of these things for the first time, or maybe you try and go on their websites and you find things out. I think now the quiet diplomacy that ECOWAS is doing is no longer relevant in this information-hungry era. This is an era that wants to know, they want to see, as things happen, they want to see on the go. Even when somebody is drinking water in their homes, they are live streaming it. And so this quiet diplomacy, ECOWAS needs to rethink it and see how it can re-strategize so that it will be more relevant to the people. And no wonder that the citizens of these ECOWAS countries often hail abuses at ECOWAS when suddenly there's a situation and ECOWAS plants itself right in the middle of it, you know. And yet these sanctions or suspensions are protocols and decisions that their member states have signed up to. And as Ebenezer said, ECOWAS does not do anything beyond its mandate, beyond what the member states have signed up to. And so when they are taking actions against Burkina Faso, against Mali, it is because those countries are citizens of ECOWAS. And as a result of that, they have submitted themselves to the authority of ECOWAS. However, the citizens oftentimes, because ECOWAS is not relevant to them on a day-to-day basis, when ECOWAS suddenly appears, then they are confounded. And so I think it's important that ECOWAS improves and builds on its PR machinery moving forward, so that we all have clarity in terms of what ECOWAS does, and then they get the necessary support from relevant people. The other point that I also want to raise is ECOWAS, we say ECOWAS is ECOWAS of the people, but to a large extent, ECOWAS is still an ECOWAS of the heads of states. And Ebenezer will probably not say it. ECOWAS officials, bureaucrats will not say it. Technocrats will not say it. But I can imagine that, you know, as commission officials, knowing the right course of action to take and yet struggling because the heads of states that take the decisions are not taking the right decisions. You know, so the whole setup of ECOWAS revolves around the heads of states and what they do or do not do. You know, so they have all these statutory meetings. The commission actually has little power when it comes to decision making. A lot of these decisions rely so much on the heads of states. And looking at Senegal and what is happening in Senegal now, for a president who I think is the immediate past president of the Africa Union Commission also, to have done what he did in Senegal, that tells us that these individuals have several flaws. And so when you make ECOWAS an ECOWAS of the heads of state, that creates problems. And we've seen a gradual erosion of ECOWAS. You know, those days in the 1990s and 2000s when ECOWAS was the ECOWAS that we all wanted to study because they were doing so much. Europeans were coming to study the ECOWAS model AU was even studying the ECOWAS model, because ECOWAS was doing so much that some of the other recs were not doing. We've seen an erosion of ECOWAS. And so it is important that if ECOWAS, and maybe I'm being too fatalistic, but if ECOWAS were to survive beyond the current onslaught, then the Commission needs to undergo severe reforms, total reforms. And I'll be interested to hear what Ebenezer thinks about it. Because he made a point earlier that whatever ECOWAS does is rooted in its instruments. Those are Ebenezer's words. It means that those instruments are no longer sufficient. They are no longer working. This has resulted in a lot of predictability, which really is not a bad thing by itself. So for example, when there's a coup d'etat or other forms of unconstitutional regime changes, I think some of us have even memorized some of the ECOWAS statements, because that, first of all, they'll condemn the coup, number one. They'll note with concern the overthrow of the government. Number three, they'll demand the immediate release of the president. Number four, they'll demand the reinstatement of the constitutional order and request for elections as soon as possible within stipulated timelines. And then they'll suspend the country, and then they'll impose sanctions. So we know these things. It's almost as if you can even dream it. When there's a problem, you can even rattle the ECOWAS statement by heart without having to even read it. So it means that all the documents that they have signed, they need to relook at it, because there are several loopholes, as they themselves have seen, that are being exploited by individuals, whether the heads of state or all kinds of entities. That the norms that they have do not, at the moment, they do not really address civilian manipulation of constitutional coup or autocratic civilian regimes. They talk about good governance, they talk about human rights abuses and other such things, but there's very little punitive measures against some of these actions or non-actions. And so it's important that ECOWAS goes back to the drawing board and look at its instruments. I mean, for me, listening to Ebenezer, I thought it would have been good to hear your thoughts on Senegal. I think you steered clear of it. This is a situation that has placed the country in a very dire situation and almost on the brink, but well, I'm a panelist, so I guess I shouldn't be asking questions. So I'm hoping that some of the participants would also chip that in. Just two more points and then I'll conclude. The third bit in terms of some of the ECOWAS actions, and as we are seeing, that sanctions do not bite as much as we think they would. They bite, but they don't wound. They don't cause a lot of injury, at least not for those who matter. So the people that the sanctions bite the most are the ordinary people, which is why they oftentimes held abusers at ECOWAS when ECOWAS issues these statements about sanctions. So there are all kinds of unintended consequences of sanctions: damage to economic stability, the damage to the social fabric, worsening security crisis, as we saw in Mali and to a certain extent Niger. Then it also leads to entrenched positions of the civilian population. It escalates inequalities in the society, and especially for women and children, the elderly, disabled, and those that are generally very vulnerable. You find that they are the ones that suffer the most when there are sanctions. At the moment, several years ago, I always say that my soap is stuck in one of the borders, because there was a certain situation where the borders were closed, and then I had ordered soap and the soap never came, because so I suffered as a result of it. So I've suffered as a result of ECOWAS sanctions, indeed. So and these are also, bearing in mind that these are countries that are already being punished by France, right, because of the policies that the military regimes have taken. So France suspends development aid and other budgetary support, to countries such as Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. So when the sanctions come in, it already worsens the situation. The final point that I want to make relates to the uniform and what I call the uniform and politics, right? And this is a dilemma that we are all trying to grapple with, So Clausewitz's statement where he says war is a continuation of politics. I think some of our African militaries have turned that around, and they are saying that politics is a continuation of war, right? So when they are not fighting wars, and then they want to enter into politics, essentially. So we've seen a history where national armies continue to play a strong role in the post-colonial African states. And we know that there's a lot of literature and data on the number of coups d'etats that have occurred in Africa. And I'm not going to go there. But we know that when the military seizes power and they are given timeline to revert to civilian rule, oftentimes they are allowed to insert themselves in the middle of these transition processes, which is almost like a reward. And maybe this is something that ECOWAS can think through and see how it can, resolve that issues. Because then you find that elections are not necessarily the solution. So giving them 18 months or 24 months or 36 months to organize elections, even if they organize the election the next day, it may not necessarily be the solution, because where you have access to political office depending on people's personal wealth, as well as all kinds of what you call the clientelist relations, where you have situations where security in some regions are so fragile, voters are threatened, the counting of ballots are problematic, then elections are not necessarily at the top of everybody's agenda. First, because they may not necessarily be credible. And so this has often lended itself to the assertion that democracy is under crisis in West Africa or Africa at large. And ECOWAS is right at the center of it, trying to figure out how we can restore this fragile democracy. I'll end here, Oye, and then give the floor to other colleagues to also come in. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation. Well, it's actually a conversation, and I think I love the frame where you assert that politics has now become the continuation of war. I think that's the PhD thesis who will engage you on that, the different forum. Please let me quickly go to the next panelist. That's Dr. Andrew Atta-Asamoah, who is the head of the African Peace and Security Governance Program at ISS in Addis Ababa. Dr. Asamoah, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Just a second. I'm being told I cannot start my video, so let me be sure of what is happening.
Let's see, I should start. Okay.
Okay. So thank you very much, Chair. You assigned me to look more at the AU's perspective in terms of all the issues that have been discussed. And so I'll try and look at 3 dimensions of everything that we are discussing, but more from the African Union's perspective. And so I will touch on 3 areas. One, the perspective from the AU's angle, looking more at the coups themselves, and then essentially how they've been handled, because I think that have both come up. Then I will touch on the issue of something I saw in the chat room, someone asking why the AU is inactive, or more or less something similar to that framing. And so I will touch on that, and then I'll look at some of the challenges the AU faces, more within the context of the fact that the AU is more of also the continental layer, which is supposed to anchor, if you like, also support what the ECOWAS is doing within the conversation we are having. So from the AU perspective, two things. I think the AU's perspective, if one needs to look at it, can only be looked at in terms of, first of all, how do they see the coups happening in West Africa? And then how are they being handled? And if you look at it that way, it leaves room for a lot of things to discuss. And I think I'm using that approach because it's very difficult to definitively have what the AU thinks of the individual case. But you can always see the AU's, make a reading of the AU as per the pronouncements and as per the frameworks the AU uses, to handle these specific cases. And so if you approach it that way and you take the coup situations to assess how the AU look at things, I think a couple of very interesting things come up. First of all, in terms of the coups themselves, the AU's framing of the coups in West Africa are not different from how they framed all other coups on the continent. And that is anchored on a number of continental frameworks, but essentially three key ones. The first is the Constitutive Act itself, Article 30 of the Constitutive Act, which provides for the suspension of countries or actors that are products of unconstitutional change of government. Second is the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance is also a major thing. And then you can also then essentially talk about the Lomé Declaration. The Lomé Declaration, which essentially is the anchor for the AU's definition of its stance on coups and of course what we are seeing in West Africa and all other related things. And if you look at the Lomé Declaration closely, there are about three definitive angles which are still apply to the way the AU sees West Africa's situation. First is the spirit of that provision, which essentially is a no tolerance policy against coups. Because in that framework, the AU became very clear about its disgust for coups on the continent of Africa. Second is the extent to which it went ahead to provide 4 instances or 4 cases which define what coups are on the continent, which is also the very template that the AU uses to look at what is happening in West Africa and what to call those happenings by their names. Essentially, issues of military coups or military involvement, issues of interventions by mercenaries, replacements of democratically elected governments by military action, and refusal of any entity to relinquish power after elections. So that is essentially how the AU frames the types of coups. And then also that declaration provides clearly what the AU should do when the coup happens. And I think it's important for us to take note of it. And essentially, first, the AU immediately, similar to the ECOWAS model, which Emma outlined, the AU, as per the Lomé Declaration, is first of all supposed to immediately desist from recognizing any de facto leadership and condemn it, and then move on to suspend that emerging coup actor from any activities of the AU, and then make use of special envoys to try and engage to bring them back to the fold. And when normalcy is restored, the AU then moves on to lift the sanctions. That is essentially the template. And so this is how the AU has seen almost all coups. We can problematize it, but the essence of it has not changed at all, and particularly not in reference to West Africa. Now, the nuances we see from the AU's part emerges when you look at the handling of the case-by-case situations in West Africa. As I indicated, in the AU's template for engagements, the AU is required to immediately make a pronouncement and swiftly move to suspend and then engage. But if you look at how the AU has handled the recent situations in ECOWAS, there are about three things that I say I imagine in terms of how the AU has been handling the situations in ECOWAS. I see a sense of an attempt to synchronize the continental response with what ECOWAS is trying to do. In the past, if a coup happened, it was almost automatic. You would hear the AU suspending that country immediately. But now, particularly in the case of West Africa, you find that the AU PSC, instead of meeting immediately, almost always now delays to try to know what the move ECOWAS is going to roll out, which is really not the normal way the AU handles these situations. I see that as an attempt to kind of try to synchronize its action with the region. Second is also what I see more as concession, well, synchronizing, but also giving a bit of concession to the AU. A sense that, giving some concession to ECOWAS. A sense that since ECOWAS is capable to manage that region, give them a bit of go ahead within the context of subsidiarity and complementarity. And that is what explains why you find that the AU delays. And in Niger, it was very clear. The AU waited quite a bit for the ECOWAS position before they went on to debate, and I'll come to that. And then we're also seeing divergence. At some point, we saw that in particular case of Niger, the AU, so this is what happened within the PSC. The conversation about after the AU had waited for the ECOWAS deliberation, the ECOWAS members within the PSC were pushing for the AU, the PSC, not to, suspend Niger, so that it will align with the fact that the ECOWAS had not called it a coup at that time, but they were pushing for the AU to endorse the move for the military, the pronouncement of the military intervention. But what we saw is that the AU smartly only took note of the regional decision to go in, but actually desisted from endorsing that. But we saw that in terms of the sanction itself, the AU also then endorsed it, which was a sense of trying to diverge from what the region had taken. Again, is something worth studying. Situations of divergence with the regions and how that is managed. But that, if you look at the way the AU has been managing coup d'etats, it's sort of trying to tread a different path when it comes to ECOWAS, purely because there's a certain appreciation of ECOWAS's capacity to make pronouncement, to see it through, and to be able to call its member states to order. And that is what also explains why you don't find the AU leading so much in the situation of ECOWAS, because essentially within the context of complementarity, ECOWAS is already on the ground doing something. But again, we are seeing divergences coming through in terms of how these things are being managed. AU took note of endorsed the sanctions, but if you look at the sanctions perspective of the AU versus what the ECOWAS is rolling out, there are many differences. We've seen the AU essentially focuses more on the suspension of member states, of the defaulting member state. There have been instances where the AU has moved on to threaten and to even to impose targeted sanctions, in the case of 2015 in Burundi. But it's not a template. So the very expansive rollout of sanctions, as we saw in ECOWAS, was not the same thing that was replicated at the continental level. Again, that was also a bit of differences in terms of how the AU has gone about it. And even if you look at the AU's move and position on sanctions, the AU, even though it's pro-suspension of members who default when it comes to UCG, is very careful about sanctions because of the impact of bilateral sanctions that are being used by other actors. And so the ECOWAS going all out with economic sanctions was not something that falls in line so much with the choices that the AU often makes or made in this particular case, even though we can all conclude that they were endorsed in any case. And so the lifting, from where I sit, the complexities around the lifting also then brings up a lot of challenges on the way forward for the AU itself, because the manipulation of the existence of the sanctions by the belligerents, let me call them belligerents, or the coup leaders, has won them a bit of space to be able to act. As to how that is going to snowball on the continental level is something we are all going to see. But in the recent visit of Ibn Chambers to Sudan, Burhan already indicated that they cannot engage or accept the AU's mediation role unless the sanctions are lifted, the suspension is lifted. So already this is giving a cue to how other actors may act going forward, which essentially means that even though the AU has been very conservative in terms of rolling out some of these options, it is clear that all of them will have to go back to the drawing board to look at what needs to be done and how they can tighten all these options going forward. And so in terms of reading the coups and how they are being handled, we find a bit of diversity, but also convergence of the two organizations. But when it comes to why the AU, not much is being seen of the AU, I didn't want to use the word inactive because I essentially disagree with the use of that word inactive. I feel the AU has been very active in these situations. But you know, what is active in the context of international organizations like the AU are usually totally different from what we would expect them to do. As a continental organization, there's always so much you can do. You will have to be active within the multilateral spaces. But one thing is clear, when the AU has a strong regional organization, you find very limited presence of the AU. And that is true of SADC, the Southern Africa region, where South Africa essentially drives, you know, the way things happen. And in West Africa, where Nigeria, in its good days, robustly leads the regional direction of things. And when it is like that, the AU gives room for these to lead, again, within the context of complementarity and subsidiarity. And so that is the sense in which I read the AU's inactivity in the region rather than the total absence completely. The challenge with the AU, now coming to my last point, Chair, I don't want to take too much time. The challenge with the AU's model for handling coups, first is now what we are seeing of the ECOWAS model, waiting for the region to act, because that leads to complexities. In a situation where the regional economic community makes a position and lobbies for the AU to go in that direction, the AU gets trapped. And in Niger, it was a very difficult diplomatic situation in many situations. But the challenges are around three areas. One is the changing nature of coups themselves. Coups are coups, and essentially at the macro level, we can say they are the same. But if you drill down, the nature and the extent of recalcitrance of the coup makers, as we are seeing, to the extent of them threatening to start their own regional economic community and alliances, is not something we've seen in the past. In the past, the Pan-African spirit, the collective security pursuit as a central framework was essentially sacrosanct. But that is being touched. And so the nature has changed, and the extent to which regional organizations and the AU can push the limits of the use of, cohesion is also changing, which means that the frameworks that the AU has had itself needs to be looked at in a very robust way. So that is one key challenge that the AU faces now. Second is the extent of inconsistencies that we've sometimes seen. The AU suspends, but sometimes the provision for the return to normalcy differs in various situations. If you compare how they handled 2014 Burkina Faso, it was different from how they handled Egypt. It was different from several other countries on the continent. But what we are seeing is that the situation of Chad essentially opened the Pandora's box, because everyone expected that that situation would have been called by its proper name and appropriately sanctioned, suspended. I'm trying not to use sanctioned so that it doesn't connote its traditional meaning, which is become very politicized. Suspended. But once that did not happen, then now we are seeing the opening of a can of worms on the continent, which is becoming very difficult to handle. So AU has, in some space, lost that moral authority it always had to insist on what needs to be done. And then now the regionalism versus, continentalism versus sovereignty, the exercise or selective exercise of sovereignty. And we've seen that even in the management of the Tigray situation, that some countries are literally making very selective use of the provisions of sovereignty when it works for them, and when it does not, they give into it. That is also becoming very problematic in this particular context, and we are seeing that playing out from Niger to Mali to Burkina Faso and Guinea. These are the confines of the challenges the AU deals with. The last I want to ask, Chair, is for all of us to reflect crucially. I know that the situation in Niger and the lifting of the sanctions has given room for a massive bashing of the use of sanctions across the continent. But from where I sit, we need intellectually to interrogate the counterfactual. If our regional organizations and the AU lose the control and the ability to call their members to order through such coercive action, what more will they have to remain who they are? That is something we will interrogate during the question time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrews, and that's why we brought you, so that we can also reflect more on how to respond to the changing nature of both military coups and the response of not only ECOWAS, but even the African Union itself. During the Q&A session, I hope we'll be able to expand more on this. Colleagues and participants, please permit me to welcome Dr. Jonathan Sandy, who is the next and the last presenter today. Dr. Jonathan Sandy is the chair of the African Union Economic, Social, and Cultural Affairs, Peace and Security Sector Cluster. We usually call it AU ECOSOC. Dr. Sandy, the floor is yours.
Hello?
Yes, we can see you.
Yeah, I can see Andy, my brother is there, and I can see Ebenezer. Look, this is short and sharp. I was even the sea coach, Andy. I'm flying to Accra and I'm doing this from the airport. I thought when I saw all the speakers, Ebenezer, I saw my sister Emma and that, and I thought this ECOWAS conversation as sons and daughters of the ECOWAS community, it was great for us to lend our voices to this conversation. And I like the last point Andy just made. It's about how do we continue the conversation. Just 2 weeks ago, many of you will have seen it on social media, the internet, Nigeria First. We launched a new initiative in ECOWAS in Abuja, called the Regional Citizens Dialogue Program on preventing and responding to unconstitutional change of government in West Africa. Ebenezer wasn't around, but we had Dr. Brown, and then we met with Sirac and others at the ECOWAS level with NIPS. So I'm very grateful that this conversation, my brother from IPATC, who have worked together, Adeoye, are continuing. I've listened to the speakers. I don't need to rehearse because we do not have time and I'm at the airport. But just from a perspective of civil society, as you know, ECOSOC is really the platform for facilitating and generating ideas on how civil society can engage into what Andy likes to call the threats, the human security threats to our peace and stability on the continent. But first, on the context, one of the things we have done several conversations on this in the region, I mean online as well. And in fact, this week we'll be back, or early next will be, I'm sure some of the speakers here will be in Accra. There'll be a conversation on the Accra Declaration too, which ECOSOC is also facilitating. And one of the areas of focus will be to take stock. What we are all referring to, is it time for reflection? So what you are doing now is really to reinforce the conversation. But what seems to be appearing, and we all know in the context we are now, is really our member states are under stress, especially those that we thought will be adding, consolidating democracy. I lived and worked in Mali, in Bamako, between 2004, 5, 6, up to 2008, as regional program manager for the small arms, ECOSOC, ECOWAS Small Arms Control Program. Mali was a shining star in terms of democratic advancement after after ATT was there. What did we see? Then the security and terrorist stress that has emerged is one of the contending factors we have. Then we also have seen the post-COVID-19 recovery process. Has it been slow or has it been more generating in terms of socio-economic revamping? And in that process, where rising cost of living and economic hardship, job unemployment as a result of the consequence of both the COVID-19 and as well as now when it even comes to funding on civil society at the local level, at the national level, maybe even at the regional level, the role of international aid and government in supporting enhanced engagement of civil society has been problematic because, sorry, you can hear sorry, but let me go on. This is part of the conversation. So donor aid effectiveness in terms of supporting civil society has also been problematic. But so in the light of all of this, the question then we have here, which as a conversation we can continue, which is quite related to what you sent me, Ade, is that do we have in place the required legal and normative frameworks to address the issue of how to prevent and respond to unconstitutional change of government? Yes, we do, like all speakers have said. We have, whether it's the Lome Declaration, whether it's the 2001 ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance. Do we have mediation units there? We have Ebenezer and I, we were in AU, now is in ECOWAS, facilitating the mediation support unit. We have those normative and policy instruments, which everyone has spoke to us. Now the question then is, how effective has the ECOWAS institutional frameworks and mechanisms using all those protocols, the tools, the normative, has been in terms of addressing, preventing and responding to military coup? The question is, yes, we are in a dilemma now, that these things have been progressing well, but is all what in our assessment it looks like, it seems that the approach we have been using are much more state-centric, and therefore that's much more related to the use of the ECOWAS Authority of Head of State and the ECOWAS Commission itself, and very limited engagement of non-state actors. I know that the academics, Kofi Annan, all of us have been involved in analysis and discussion of the implications of that. But how effective the ECOWAS Commission itself and the AU has engaged the role of civil society and university think tanks has been problematic. So in terms of effectiveness in utilizing the institutions and mechanisms, it has been more state-centric. The use of His Excellency Bola Tinubu and his friends coming together, but we have not seen much of civil society engagement. When I said civil society, I mean here, where are the religious sector, the religious institutions? Where are the academics? Where are all the civil societies on the ground, the national civil society themselves? Above all, where are the political parties in this voice? We are not hearing much of in these countries where democracy has evolved. I mean, we had elections there in the past. We had parliament. We had political parties. We are not hearing the voice of political parties, whether opposition parties or parties that were in government. It seems that whether in Mali, in Niger, and then in Burkina Faso, the voice of opposition parties or political parties themselves, religious leaders, seems to, that space has been shrinking. So at the end of the day, how do we, the last question I have then is, what role has civil society really played in terms of engagement in reinforcing, whether for mediation, whether for intervention? It is clear that the conversation like we are doing today is one role civil society is doing. Number two, in terms of early warning and analysis, ONEP and many other research institutions and think tanks have been doing a great job. In terms of policy advisory notes, opinion advisory thing, analysis, Andy and I, for example, were in Lagos few months ago down last year, trying to develop a policy framework to support, reinforce the thinking through the PSC and the ECOWAS region. So civil society has been playing those normative or software approach. But down on the ground, two things. One, at the ECOWAS level, I'm happy now that when the foreign ministers met in terms of the Mediation and Security Council, paragraph 25 of that outcome document, they advised ECOWAS to broaden their engagement with civil society, meaning traditional leaders, civil society, right on the ground at the regional level, and also think tanks, academics. That was it. So that's a good way to go. But at the moment, in terms of real engagement of between state actors and civil society has not been very much effective, especially in reinforcing the mediation capacity on the ground. The voices of our civil society across the member states has been very weak as well, with the exception of few, like we have seen in Senegal. Senegal, our colleagues Alpha and Bay and others have done extremely well. Even in the Gambia, civil society has pushed. Ghana is doing a relative well with Wadimos and other institutions jumping on into this. But the problem we still have is, as I did say, we need to close that gap between the ECOWAS institutions and mechanisms, including ECOWAS parliament has not done much. The court itself, how much are they effective? So it seems that the fight or against the fight of the response mechanism has always been between the head of state and the ECOWAS Commission. And I'm very happy that whilst we were 2 weeks ago in Abuja, Dr. Sirac himself, the director of peace and, peacekeeping and security, made it clear that they were happy that we are now coming to engage. I mean, academic think tanks, because our job, ECOSOC, is to facilitate that to happen. So in a nutshell, that when we come to Q&A and the way forward, maybe we'll have 1 or 2 recommendations. How can we enhance effective engagement of non-state actors in terms of reinforcing both the ECOWAS Commission, the AU, and as well as the head of state, whether through mediation support activities or through research, analysis, and such of this conversation. How do we influence? Are the normative framework, the instrument, are they sufficient, like Andy described, and then some other colleagues have described? Where are we pick and choose in terms of approach to sanctions, for example? In sanctions against here, we have lifted the humanitarian, economic, and financial sanctions. What is the implication? And I am happy my brother Andy has just mentioned the reaction of Sudan. Lastly, we need to interrogate the role of the military elites themselves. I mean, I come from this sector. I've been a national security advisor and coordinator, head of services. So the question then is, in the process of advancing our democracy, is state governance, is this a meal ticket for the soldier or the military? We need to interrogate this. We need to be entered. So the debate around civil-military relationship need to evolve. Lastly, even though the normative frameworks we have and the policy framework, whether the Lome Declaration, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, as well as the supplementary protocol, the Protocol on Democracy and Governance 2002 for ECOWAS. Where is civil society on this debate? The West African Civil Society Forum, workshop, which we had, why is it not effective now in bringing? We did very well with using that framework in Côte d'Ivoire in those days and many in Sierra Leone and in Liberia. But the voice of civil society, in my honest view, in the region, in West Africa, with the exception of the academics and think tanks like Kofi Annan, ONEP, and few, we need to stimulate that conversation. So for them to amplify their voice, to say the military to go back to the barracks, it is not their business to be advancing that, yes, security threats are there. Are the military ad hoc security arrangement, for example, foreign interference and foreign fighters, mercenaries, who've been doing some work on this, they're all over the place. Why are our militaries inviting ad hoc arrangements in terms of military stabilization operation, but yet the security sector governance and then their own role, constitutional role, are being neglected? So I just thought that we should stimulate those conversations, but I think the bottom line is that I'm happy that the policy of, the Mediation and Security Council have directed that the ECOWAS Commission should broaden its engagement with this kind of debate we are on together, as well as facilitating that. I'm sure when it comes to reinforcement, people like ex-servicemen, we have not used them much. Now we are listening to former president of Gowon of Nigeria, who made a very salient point, who now is stimulating the conversation. And in our regional center, we have a lot of force commanders. For example, Major General Lucky Irabu is part of our team. Police commissioners who have operated in multinational task force in crisis and stabilization intervention. We can pull all of these resources together of retirees who then can inform the kind of approach in terms of whether mediation and sanction regimes. But at the moment, I'm very happy that as we move forward, how do we interrogate further this sanction, the lifting sanction? What are the implications? Not only for socio-economic or humanitarian reason, are we going to see the emergence of more military coups as a result of these kind of approaches? Remember, on the November 26th last year, Sierra Leone was the least country where we will have experienced military coup. It was just the save of the grace that we did not go through that. But I'm just saying it is not over. The debate should continue, but it's not only about how much the response mechanism will come, whether lifting the sanction will solve that problem. But the strategic dilemma is the lifting of the sanction, appeasing the Niger, the military khaki boys along that. Is that enough for us to say, yes, it is all over? Have we seen even the sign that they are welcoming the lift of sanctions? Are they ready to stick to the political transition roadmaps? Those are the dynamic things. And this is where perhaps when we come, we can reflect on how much civil society and non-state actors, including ISS, and all of you can contribute in terms of the future of the ECOWAS we want, in realizing the vision of Vision 2050. Over to you, my brother.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sandy. And if I will be truthful, I didn't expect less. I know we have engaged before, and I love your expansive reflections on security issues and issues that borders on democracy and governance. Thank you so much. In as much as we don't want you to miss your flight, if you still stay with us for the next couple of minutes, we'll be glad to also have a few reflections from you during the Q&A. But colleagues, I think it's better to quickly open the floor for engagement. And when Dr. Sandy was also speaking of retired military personnel, my mind went to Major General Ishola Williams, who is also here with us. And I've just seen his hand. So colleagues, please, if you want to ask questions, I've seen some questions on the chat box, but I would really prefer that people speak up and actually ask the question. You can unmute, and I'm sure our colleagues will help you to do that. If you even need to put on your video so that we can match the voice with a face, you can also put on your video and ask your question. But please keep your question very short. If it is a comment, kindly keep it very short, as I usually say, so that you don't present again. Thank you so much. I will recognize Major General Retired Ishola Williams. The floor is yours for your question or your comment. And I hope you will also respond to Dr. Sandy on the role of ex-military men. Thank you.
I'll be very quick. What is important is this, is that we must find out when coups happen, why do they happen? Not to generalize. What we have seen in West Africa, except for Guinea, the military boys could not cope with the conflict situation in their countries. And those international partners who have been helping before could not cope. UN also went there, and UN too could not cope. Okay? Therefore, the military boys who could not cope were looking for assistance from within Africa itself, and especially from ECOWAS, from the standby brigade, or from whatever, that could help them to be able to defeat those who are using the structure of the state altogether. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Until today, people are still dying. That is the number one problem. And nobody is talking about that. Okay? The second point is what Dr. Ima has said. If you remember about, how many people in West Africa know about ECOWAS? They know about UN. They don't know much about the African Union. How much more to talk about ECOWAS? That point, and that is the key made by Dr. Coleman. Sovereignty. AU and ECOWAS are helpless because the member states are sovereign. They are not like European Union. Even with the case of European Union, Hungary or a member can hold them up from making a decision. And the point is this, is that we must separate the heads of state, but they have no power to implement, okay? Because they have no capacity, and the structure that is there, they have no resources to be able to enable that structure. Therefore, we must remember that the decisions are not made by them. And that's why the staff in ECOWAS think tanks like Kofi Annan and so on are there. Now, the question now is this, is that do people listen who are in ECOWAS Secretariat, do they listen to ideas or suggestions or whatever plans come from outside to be able for them to do better? And finally, every coup must be analyzed separately before you react. And therefore, the need now is to work at various scenarios. But I must say that if you don't have a good political system, and I think the presidential system is the worst system for Africa, we need a parliamentary system in which there are always an opposition in waiting. In that case, the military cannot become the opposition. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk.
Thank you so much, Major General Ishola. Yes, I also need to recognize Ambassador Jerry Matijila. I can see your hand is up. What we will do is to take a round of questions and we'll come back to our panelists. And I can see about 5 hands up. So Ambassador Jerry, please, you can unmute and you can speak. Ambassador Jerry? Okay, maybe I can move to Suraj Mudasiru. I can also see your hand is up. You can unmute and you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you. Let me first and foremost thank the organizers of this seminar. It's quite refreshing, you know, and it's very hard. So that's why I have to key into it this evening. Yeah, I am seeing a different situation, and I want us to also, you know, interrogate this situation. Most of the coups, or if not all of the coups in the Sahel, are attributing part of the reason for the coup to the dominance of France in their economic and political situation. Now, with the situation in the countries, particularly with the military coups in those countries, is this not a good opportunity for ECOWAS to support those countries in the Sahel region to delink from France in order to pave way for the evolution of ECO currency? Because for me, the dominance of France and the so much the tie between France and its former colonies is one major reason that is affecting the evolution of ECO currency, which is one of the primary objectives of ECOWAS, you know, to get things going in the sub-region. That is one. Then secondly, I want to direct this question to Dr. Asamoah, that how do we relate with an organization that abhors military coup, but silent on bad governance that can engineer military coup? In this situation, I'm talking about ECOWAS, that before this military coup, things were happening in these countries. What has ECOWAS been doing? Of course, I realize the fact that ECOWAS has primary objective of bringing economic integration, you know, among member states in the Sahel, in the, you know, West Africa. But you see, the point I'm making is we are all privy to, you know, the political situation in most of these countries of member states of ECOWAS. We know what governance, you know, thrive in those countries. What has ECOWAS been, particularly AU? The question about NEPAD, you know, that has peer review mechanism in AU. That peer review mechanism has not been working. And it's like there is no driver for that peer review. As a matter of fact, who is going to drive it? Because the countries that are supposed to be hegemonic countries in the continent are also guilty of this bad governance. Therefore, the fact that they cannot peer review their governance system, you know, account for what, you know, what we are witnessing in these countries in West Africa. So I am looking at it that there is the need for ECOWAS and more importantly, AU to review their, you know, peer review mechanism and make it work so that we can have, you know, understanding of what governance will be in Africa and in West Africa to avoid military coup that we are talking about. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much. I'm sure the panelists will respond to your question. Ambassador Jerry Makila, I think your hand is still up. You can proceed to ask your question or comment. It's good to have you here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thanks very much. Dr. Akinola, thanks very much. I learned so much about what is happening in that region. I was reflecting deeply, Dr. Akinola, as the colleagues were making submissions. And I was saying to myself that historically, some of these countries are going for the second or third coup in the last X number of years. So the question I asked myself, why repeatedly a coup? Why we have coups? And are these the last coups? Like the last speaker was saying, I think it was Sandy. Are these the last coups? We had this If you look at Guinea, we had coups, Niger, we had coups, Mali, we had coups. And this is the last coups. Why are they repeating? Are we solving the problem that leads to this coups or not? The second question is a national question. Have you resolved the issue of the national question in these countries? And are the foundations of nation building in this country strong enough to help to stabilize these countries? The third one is, do we still experience foreign intervention as a catalyst too, or as a way of instigating movement towards coups or not? I asked myself this question, as community was saying. So I hope as a panelist, perhaps run off, they can help with these issues at Akinola. Why are the coups in some of these countries coming over and over? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Jerry. Thank you so much, sir, for the questions. Like I said, our panelists are here and they will offer their short reflection before we end the program. But of course, the conversation will continue. Bolanle Shiabande, can you unmute and ask your question? But please make it very quick. And let the comment be very short or question. Thanks. We can't hear you. We can't hear you, Bolanle. We can't hear you. I think, I'm sorry, maybe you can ask later. I will have to quickly move to Gerard. I can see your hand is up. Can you kindly unmute and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the really insightful presentations to all the panelists. My question is a tricky one. I don't understand why in the title of this seminar you omit to mention, to refer to constitutional coup. I see there only this term military coup, and I don't understand why we don't have the expression constitutional coup. Maybe I've been wondering to see whether for the past several years across the continent, whether we experience more military coups than constitutional coup. Maybe let me give you just a figure here and then I will stop and maybe we can proceed from there. In West Africa, when I look at the Eyadema family, that is the son and the father who passed on. Both of them spent 57 years in power. When I move now to Central Africa, we look at the Mbongo family, that is the deceased father, Ali Mbongo, and the cousin. Both of them, anyway, that family spent 57 years accumulated in power. I moved to Equatorial Guinea. The father and the son, the family Obiang, they are in power for 45 years. In Congo, the father is there, it's been already 47 years. In Cameroon, we have Paul Biya, 49 years. And finally in Chad, both Déby is already 34 years. I mean, we have a total of 6 families who spent accumulated 289 years in power. And I'm a bit surprised to see that you don't consider this as a coup. But I think this is really something that is more serious than military coup, and something must be done about it. So all this coup happening today, maybe the military one, to go back to the main topic, does it mean that we have to think about a new form of political system in Africa? Is democracy is really what we need? Because we can see that it seems like it's not working. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gerard. In as much as I'm not a panelist, and I will also still allow the panelists to respond to some of the points you have made. What we intend to do is to focus on not just on constitutional change of government, not tenure elongation, not seat-titism. We only want to focus on military takeover. Other conversation may focus on your concern, but like I said, the panelists may still address your concern, which is also jamming to all of us, because we agree with you, but the focus of this webinar is on military coup. Thank you. Maybe I can come back to, oh, okay. I can see Olawale Yemisi. Please, can you make your questions very short, because we've actually run out of time and we'll still allow the panelists to quickly reflect.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for the organizers of the group. And this is my first time meeting Dr. Akinola, and it's nice meeting you, sir. My question, I have 3 questions, in which one Ambassador Jerry has asked one. And I want to know the role of the Western countries in the dictation of sanctions and in the power politics played during military coup. We can see the role of BRICS, the Russia and the Wagner group, when there was military takeover in Niger. So my primary question in that aspect is, does Western countries have influence on the nature of sanctions that are being melted on military coup? And the second question is about the ECOWAS of state and ECOWAS of people. There is a shift from ECOWAS of state to ECOWAS of people. Now, is there a way that, I don't know, I'm asking, is there a way sanctions can be melted on the khaki boys while the ordinary people do not suffer? I don't know if there is a way. And the last question talks about the first speaker who spoke about the restoration of democracy. That is there democracy even in West Africa that we want to restore it? And which kind of democracy are we talking about after military coup? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olawale Yemisi. Thanks for your question. And lastly, who allow Kehinde Ayeni to ask his question or give his comments? Kehinde Ayeni, over to you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Please, I just want to ask this straightforward question, especially from the man that presented from ECOWAS. We know that the excuse that these guys most time give when they take over from civilian government is bad governance. Recently, there has been a kind of, would I say, a silence advocate in Nigeria that with the trend of things, there is possibility of these guys taking over, but we know that the federal government refuted the claim. But the question is this, for ECOWAS, is there a possibility for them internally to have a kind of mechanism to engage their member states to actually do what they are meant to do? Of course, the other woman has presented that we know that the ECOWAS is being, in a way, cornered by the head of the state. But then, as an organization, I don't know. It's possible because with the trend of things in Africa, West Africa in particular, things are getting out of hand. So for me, as an individual, I think ECOWAS really need to sit up and to call its member states to order. that is my contribution in a way, asking the question of what ECOWAS can do to actually improve in giving the member states what they require from their leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kehinde Ayeni. I think we will have to come back to our panelists. What we will do, I think it's better to start with Dr. Sandy so that he can give his final reflection on any part of the question and also maybe provide one or two recommendations going forward. Please, our panelists, I will restrict you to maximum of 2 minutes to respond to any of the questions. So Dr. Sandy, I think I will start with you.
Thank you again, my brother, Akin. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, I will just start with the last speaker who made some very useful contribution. It's about this concept of buying time. The boys, the khaki boys, let me use the young scholars' this definition about the khaki boys. You know, my former Dr. James Jonah used to call them the khaki boys, and so I will stick to that as well. So are they buying time? And what are the implications of buying time now with lifting humanitarian, economic, and financial stuff? So that's one thing I want to leave with, continue to reflect on. Number two, also how relationship. I'm sure we all continue to talk about foreign interference and influence, but how much, apart from external actors out of the continent, how much also does some of these countries that have gone through military coups and they're under sanctions, how much are they related to other member states in ECOWAS? Are there possibilities of other neighboring states being spoilers to what the overall ECOWAS shared value is? ECOWAS of the people. That's where we want to go, citizens. And for some of the questions Jenna Ishola asked, very interesting ones, whether people are even aware, citizens are aware of the normative and legal frameworks which you're all familiar with. I agree 100% that many of our people, we need to intensify. One of my recommendations would be, how do we popularize and increase the level of awareness, both from the lens of academia, civil society on the ground, including youths and young scholars, for them to engage into the debate, because it's not still over. And the question then is, I continue to ask, in the absence of opposition voices, then is the military the alternative to democracy, like democratic governance? So that's an important question. We need also to see how we can engage in the debates on civil-military relationships, which have long passed away. So generally, some of the questions Jerry asked, I'll keep those ones, but I'm sure it will continue with the conversation on why the coups are there. The nation-building process, state building and nation building, we need to interrogate that. I continue to tell people that while we appreciate what ECOWAS, ECOMOG, the international community, multilateralism did in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, which we are all so proud of, that's the greatest achievement, and the Gambia now. But the question is, why do we need those nation states that we have interventionist model worked very well, whether responsibility to protect or ECOMOG, we went there, used all the instruments, multilateralism worked in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. Why did it work? Why is it now not working? Second, why do we need those nations? To look carefully about it. The idea is that they are still fragile. The state institutions are extremely fragile, we are put, whether through security sector reform and governance. I can tell you for sure, for example, the identity politics, diversity, tribal and regional identity politics are permeating into the security sector institutions. Maybe Andy can attest to it, but I can tell you, even in Sierra Leone now, we are trying to do a strategic review of the national security institutions to know what are the nature and type of tribe, region and tribal balance. So we need to look at all those lenses and see how we can, and this is where, as I did say, civil society and academia, we can come in, whether not only informing policy analysis, but focusing on how do we promote issues around constitutional order and state legitimacy. How can we enhance the preservation of electoral processes? AU and ECOWAS, they just go to observer missions and they leave. So how do we ensure that we have long-term people engaged into electoral processes from legal reforms and all of that? So I just will stop that, and I'm sure colleagues have more, but this is a continued debate. I'm still here. If there is anything more to add as we conclude, it is welcome. But I'm very grateful that this debate will continue, and particularly, how do we reinforce, engage? ECOWAS Commission is here, Ebenezer is here. How do we tap into the rich diversity of knowledge from civil society and non-state actors, particularly ex-servicemen, in enhancing the mediation process, and as well as preventing and responding to future coup d'etats? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sandy. And well, since you have also mentioned ECOWAS, I think I will come back to Mr. Ebenezer. And I know a lot of comments and reflections have been directed along your path, and I know that your shoulders are so big that you can accommodate this within 2 or 3 minutes. And we have your last reflection, Mr. Ebenezer.
Thanks very much, Akinola, and also thanks colleagues and fellow panelists, and also other participants that have actually posed some questions. We appreciate everything, and this is very engaging, I must admit. Well, as you indicated, there are quite a number of questions and also issues that were raised targeting ECOWAS. I don't know if I can do all these things. I can respond to all this within the time frame that I have, but I'll try to make some few comments about that. First of all, I know my co-panelist, Emma, was raising some question that who or what is ECOWAS? Indeed, I mean, we've had this conversation several times, so Emma is very much aware. Indeed, she also tried to give what is it, answers to some of them. First of all, when we talk about ECOWAS, ECOWAS is not the ECOWAS Commission. ECOWAS, as we know, the highest what they call organ, decision-making organ, is the authority of heads of states. It's the authority that decides, and they direct. Commission as a secretariat always implement what the authority says. So, and of course, as a secretariat, you can't go against what the authority is requesting or requiring you to do. So that is ECOWAS. ECOWAS is member states. And of course, she also mentioned the fact that, I mean, we are now talking about not ECOWAS of state, but move from ECOWAS of state to ECOWAS of the people, prosperity for all. Indeed, as in response to that, the ECOWAS of the people mantra, we on our own are trying to see how best we can actualize one of the dreams of the revised treaty. I have West Africa. So, and this is supposed to be the civil society, the people's voices. This is going to be a platform that will galvanize the civil societies and the voices so that they can be reflected at the highest level. So this is something that is ongoing. Any unforeseen circumstances would have this particular organ established by end of the year, so that we will have the incorporation of the civil society and the voices of the ordinary community citizens. So that may be a response to the last before signing off, that there is a need to actually incorporate the voices of what they call the ordinary community citizens, to give meaning to the ECOWAS of the people, so that the voices will be heard. I know there were also other issues, other questions that were raised. Time limits, I will try and answer just the few of them that were raised. Somebody asked in the Q&A portion on the question as to the coups in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, they were prompted by security concerns. Well, security reasons were given. For instance, in Burkina Faso, especially both first and the second coup d'etats. But I mean, come to think of it, military coup d'etat. Before the coup d'etat, security concerns, indeed, just around 700,000 were what they call IDPs, internally displaced people, as a result of the security of the incursions of these terrorist armed groups and all that. Post-military takeover, in 50% of the country, that was under the control of, outside the control of the country. That the one that was taking what they call, that was overthrown. I've forgotten the name of the president. That's areas that were outside of the government control. There wasn't going to be elections, and all the political parties agreed. Elections, best elections. The country was just about 70% under the control, but with the overthrow of the military by the military rulers, we have had now over 2 million IDPs. The country is virtually outside the control of the states. So have they really responded to that security concerns? So you can't say that indeed, if it was, then the democratic government were better placed to actually address the security concern better than the one that we are seeing from the military. Same can be said to that. In fact, the security, Niger was doing better than these 3 countries in the Sahel. But after the overthrow of the democratically elected government, see the level of security deterioration that we had. So it is really not the case that indeed what prompted that was actually security concerns. But of course, I mean, people have different views. You could also say that it was mere military adventurism that actually led to that. That said, let me move to one key thing that Andy said regarding the fact that if you are talking about sanctions and their impact and all that, what are we going to have as something that would possibly fight off some of these things? We have to also, identify the current geopolitical environment that we find ourselves in. Indeed, you can see that there is an emergence of multipolarism. And this one is impacting on regionalism. Of course, we have increasing geopolitical and geostrategic interest and shifts. And also we are having a bit of dysfunctioning in multilateralism. All these 3 coming together is actually impacting on and also weighing heavily on some of these situations that we are having. Why is it that these countries, 3 countries particularly, the Sahel Alliance countries, are chasing away France and with the same alacrity receiving Russia? If they are talking about complaining about foreign influence, is Russia not a foreign partner? What influence would Russia have over them? All these things are happening is because of the current multi-polar situation that we find ourselves in. Post late 1980s and early 1990s, when most of these countries transited from military or authoritarian regime to democratic liberal democracy. Of course, basically because of the fall of or the end of the Cold War era. You could see that because we had this kind of unipolar system, everybody was swept in the line. Liberal democracy was the one, so that whoever fell foul of that, you were whipped in the line. Then every country was following. Now we have a situation where we have emergence of multipolarism. Russia has come up. Well, of course, we have America still there. We have also other countries in the EU. We even have other smaller powers like Turkey, Iran, UAE, and all that, with high geopolitical interest in member states. And that whenever some of these, for lack of better word, rogue countries have their way, there is one or two of these supporting them against the regional body that they belong to. So therefore, you find ourselves that what we had in the 90s up until recently, it's losing. I mean, the unipolar power that we have in US and the liberal democracy, because of the emergence of all these kind of powers, countries have alliances that when they do things, they have that kind of support. So that actually is also something that we need to interrogate, and the impact that it's having on the stability and also consolidation of liberal democracy. I think with time, I may not be able to expatiate more on that. But of course, there are opportunities for us to still continue engaging each other on some of these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ebenezer. I know there's so much to say, and we are also ready to and willing to listen to you, but because we have outshot our time limits, I'm so sorry that we have to quickly come back to our other panelists. I hope they will be able to keep it shorter, very, very short. Maybe I will come to Dr. Andrews. I think it's better to come back to you now. Then I will call on Dr. Abdul and I will allow Dr. Emma to round up today's discussion. Dr. Andrews, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Given the time, I'll be very brief on the key questions. One is the one from Sure Mudasiru, who was asking what ECOWAS and even the AU, what they've done about constitutional manipulations. So essentially, this is it. Coups cannot be addressed in isolation. I know we are all pretty much upbeat about coups, but it's a symptom of deeper issues when it comes to the broader governance landscape of any given country. And so the whole response that ECOWAS has rolled out, if you look at the whole good governance protocol and the whole range of things that were done over the years, and which many of us have praised the ECOWAS for in the past, serves to define the collective search for states that are capable of really not undermining the whole democratic governance landscape. So in a way, you can say that something has been done, not just about the coup, but a wide range of things that need to happen for things like this not to, happen in any given country. But to the extent of the direct involvement of countries that are active members of AU and ECOWAS, we find very little really happening to the extent that citizens expect. And an example was given of the immediate past chair of the AU Assembly, Senegal, and all that is happening in the country. But the challenge we need to appreciate for our regional and continental organizations, which are operating within the confines of multilateral expectations, is that when these things are still within the member states, sometimes it's very difficult for you to go in guns blazing, saying that you are coming to act when there's a certain government that claims to be capable to rule their own, enclave. And so those are the challenges. One would wish that preventive diplomacy will kick in, but we see the whole disconnect between early warning and preventive action. And so one cannot say a lot has been done in that domain. There's even a history as to why issues of constitutional manipulation and other related definitions were excluded in the AU's listing of situations that constitute coup d'etats on the continent. And so some things have been done, but from where I sit, essentially not enough, if you like. There was also a question about why coups are recurring. And I will agree with Jonathan when he says that the whole state building process is ongoing. And I would put it bluntly that state building in Africa is an unfinished business. And so this wave of coups we've seen is not the last we are going to see. And if you look at the three waves, if you count this wave of coups as the third one, the first one was in the 60s and early 70s, if you like. And then we saw the second wave in the 90s, up to the late 90s, which led to the Lomé Declaration. So this one is about the third wave. If you look closely, all of them have come to raise questions about the nature of governance at that time. And so this one we are seeing is clearly asking questions about the democratic dividends that we all pushed for. I mean, the practice we've all pushed for. But the question is about the utility of this option of governance we've opted for. And so I think we need to dig deeply also about why this is happening and the philosophical questions it's asking of where we need to go as a continent. And then the question about for the khaki boys, whether these sanctions, can be tailor-made for the khaki boys so that it doesn't affect citizens. Yes. And let me use that as a segue then to give my opinion on this whole sanctions thing. The use of the sanctions, I will not technically fault the use of the sanctions, but I will fault the type of sanctions that were rolled out and those who were targeted, and then the effect we are seeing. There are two types of it. You have the comprehensive sanctions, which often become economic in themselves. And then you have the targeted sanctions, which many call smart sanctions. I think what would have been ideal would have been for us to go for smart sanctions in the case of ECOWAS, which is really targeting the coup makers and restricting their mobilities and access. And I think that there are ways of doing that, which will target the khaki boys. But again, sometimes the difficulties about sanctions is not about the facts of it. It's about the perceptions and the manipulation of the sanctions regime, which is where all these coup makers in West Africa have won. If you look at what Eben was saying, some of the sanctions were not in place in Burkina Faso and others, but they succeeded in pushing themselves into the bandwagon so they could benefit from, the mobilization of sentiments against the regional action. And that is where ECOWAS struggled, because sanctions are a tool which do not in themselves lead to an end. They need to move with very swift diplomatic action. Putting that together, I think the khaki boys can be targeted better to achieve what we need on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrews. And well, the conversation will continue, and we're also waiting to keep reading you on Daily Maverick and others, so know that you will push forward some of these points. we are glad that we also have people like you on the continent still trying to respond intellectually to some of these crises and problems we have found ourselves in, particularly in the Sahel. Let me just call on Dr. Emma finally to give our own final reflections as short as possible. Then we'll call on Ms. Ratitso to close the meeting. Thank you, Dr. Emma.
Yes, thank you so much to my fellow panelists and to participants for the questions and suggestions. I think they are all fantastic, and my fellow panelists have already answered all the questions essentially, so I have very little to say. I think the only thing that maybe I would add to this moving forward is I think maybe there's a lot too much concentration on especially at the regional and even the AU level on the peace and security centered protocols and declarations and decisions. There are so many other policy instruments that AU or even ECOWAS has, which if they focused on, these would help in preventing conflict. So if you look at I think ECOWAS policy framework on security sector governance, a fantastic document that seeks to support the building up of institutions in member states, building up the security sector in member states, helping to professionalize. And in saying professionalizing the security forces, it is not just about sending them for training to military schools abroad and the like. It's about making sure that they do their work in ways that benefit the citizens. They are responsible, and they understand their duty, they understand their mandate in the Constitution. And such documents would help to a large extent, because if ECOWAS, let's say, prioritizes, and you realize that I think there are so few member states that actually know that such policy frameworks exist. You know, all we talk about are the 1999 conflict mechanism, we talk about the small arms protocol conventions and the like. But the documents such as the policy framework on security sector governance, there it talks about rule of law mechanisms. It talks about the police. It talks about the military, how to support and professionalize it. If we focused on such policy frameworks, I think it would help to a large extent, because you would realize that the other point that I also make in tandem with this is around, I think Sandy already spoke about it, was on issues of civil society. And I realized that civil society, because I mean, there was a point earlier on where, and one of my fellow panelists was saying, well, ECOWAS cannot just go in and impose its will on the people. But when the people themselves stand up against what is unconstitutional, you realize that it's very difficult for these actors to have their way. And we saw that recently in Senegal, you know, as much as we all know, President Macky Sall really did want to have his way there. The way civil society in Senegal stood up and said, no, 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 this will never happen. And we saw that because civil society was strong and their voices were heard, it's reflected in the ruling of the Constitutional Council, which said, well, no, you can't do this. Organize elections as soon as possible. And we see that a date has been set. You know, so if we have strong institutions, rule of law mechanisms, if our courts are strong, if our civil society organizations are strong, if our police is strong, if our militaries are professional, you realize that they will not really be interested. I mean, in professionalism, it also talks about, you know, their welfare issues, obviously. Politics these days is about bread and butter, as we've come to realize. And so if you want to professionalize the military, it means that you have to ensure that you give them welfare packages that would prevent them, and maybe I'm being naive here, that will prevent them from trying to make incursions into politics. The final point that I want to make, since I think I'm standing between you all and your dinners, is on the issues around trying to revamp some of our policy instruments on, for example, the ECOWAS 2001 protocol on democracy and good governance, in trying to plug all those loopholes within that protocol, especially when it comes to term limits. The challenge with that is that, as Ebenezer said, the Secretariat or the Commission cannot take any decision outside of what the authority wills. And it's a bit like, as we say, the United Nations Security Council. We are saying that, we want to expand the P5, right? And if you want to expand the P5, who should make that decision? It's the same P5. Who wants to lose power? Everyone that has power doesn't want to lose some of it, because if they bring in others, they reduce their powers. So it's probably the same thing. The heads of states, if they decide that they would impose term limits, and we've seen a lot of opposition to it. I think it's just a few countries that have that. Those that had term limits, as we are seeing, are trying to redo their constitutions to not have term limits, and that's a problem. So maybe we need to go back to those instruments again, and maybe with the support of civil society at the national level, we can get the citizens to push for such measures. Because if the citizens insist that you cannot have more than 2 terms in office, then it's really going to be difficult for the head of state to do anything about it. So I think it's back to the issue that we are saying, ECOWAS of the people, and the people are the ones that need to take the action, because we've seen that our heads of state, we really cannot rely on them. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your final notes. I will thank the panelists and also our participants. Of course, we will continue engaging on this, and if we have our way, 1 week is not even enough to discuss the ECOWAS case, talk less of other crises on the continent. So I hope we'll be able to call upon you anytime for such interaction, such conversation, even physically, if we need to invite you to come and dialogue and have conversation with us. And if we have our way, I'd also love to bring all the participants to Johannesburg so that we can also continue discussing this. Thank you, and we will see you again. Permit me to hand over to my colleague, our very own Ms. So over to you to close this.
Evening, everyone. First, I'd like to thank our chair for handling this discussion. I'd also like to thank our panelists, Mr. Ebenezer, Dr. Abdul, Dr. Emma, Dr. Sandy, Dr. Andrew. Thank you very much for your time, and to our attendees, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to attend this event. And would like to thank also Ms. Ndawonde in the background for assisting us with the Zoom and managing this meeting. A few highlights from this meeting are: ECOWAS has stuck to its democratic values and instruments. However, the challenge is that it has proven to be an institute for heads of states. Thus, it needs to truly reform to be more people-centric. The sanctions that have been imposed on Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger do not necessarily affect those it is meant to, but they affect the most vulnerable, who are women, children, and the elderly. Thus, it is important to ask, who is the entity called ECOWAS? In as much as they say that they are people-centric, they have proven to be state-centric. Hence, this is also shown when they consider that the commissioner himself does not have as much power as Dr. Emma stated. In relation to the African Union, its role has significantly decreased as they are increasingly taking more time to respond to unconstitutional changes in governments and waiting for ECOWAS to act, which can be viewed by trying to have a more synchronized approach. However, this is not the case. Lastly, Dr. Jonathan Sandy emphasized that civil society needs to be included when ECOWAS and AU make their decisions, because the cause of coups is rooted mainly in the inability to democratize, slow recovery from COVID-19, the rise in cost of living and reduction in government and international organization aids to civil society. Lastly, the AU and the ECOWAS have instruments that are good at stopping military coups, but have proven to be ineffective because they are largely state-centric and exclusionary to civil society. On behalf of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All the best.
What? See you, Emma. I'm on my way to Accra.
Ow!
Yeah, I hope I see you soon.
I'll definitely see you, Dr. Sandy. Safe journey.
Thank you very much. Emma, let's keep in touch, eh?
Sure, Evan.
There's a lot to talk about.
Send your contact. Yeah?
Okay, all right. I'm gonna send you a message right now.